You see, I had noticed a very intimate and inappropriate relationship between spirituality and consumerism. And I gave it a name in this essay. I named it Consumer Spirituality. Consumer spirituality is the marriage between consumerism and spirituality. It's the mainstream pop culture spirituality of today that essentially trains us to be better consumers and inadvertently perpetuates blind conformity. Inadvertently, not purposefully, inadvertently perpetuates blind conformity to the often dominating and oppressive structures of consumer capitalism. Turns out I wasn't the only person to see this affair. My essay was shared by hundreds of people and even amongst ministers, both inside and outside of the Science of Mind community. In my essay, I identify 4 things that consumer spirituality does. 1, it appropriates and commodifies ancient spiritual teachings. It cherry picks the positive aspects of other spiritual traditions, packages and sells them so they are palatable and easily consumed by the Western world. 2, consumer spirituality promotes self-interest and personal development over all else. Spirituality is offered not as a way to alleviate collective suffering and to create social change, but to become more personally productive, efficient, comfortable, and wealthy. Number 3, consumer spirituality teaches us to be relentlessly positive and to seek pleasant emotional experiences at all costs. So uncomfortable human emotions like pain, grief, anger, rage, they are shunned and labeled as low vibe and negative and cast as the opposite of spiritual enlightenment. And number 4, consumer spirituality encourages overconsumption and materialism. It teaches us that the universe is infinite, so we can manifest whatever we want. Think big. But when this spiritual principle is tied, married to consumerism, it only ends up reinforcing the vicious cycles of overconsumption that perpetuate poverty, racism, inequality, corruption, and environmental degradation around the world. I began to see that consumer spirituality, the mainstream pop culture spirituality of today, is really designed to be a capitalist product for privileged, affluent Westerners. What's missing are the values of community, civic discourse, social justice, compassion for those who are suffering, as well as an honest and sobering look at the systems that perpetuate racism, inequality, and oppression in the first place, and most importantly, how we contribute to them. To my dismay, I realized that I was practicing and preaching consumer spirituality. I was touting the tools of manifestation like they were some cure-all to all of our life's problems. And I began to wonder, is this what I'm learning at Science of Mind as well? Is this what Science of Mind is about? Because let's be honest with ourselves, and it's important that we can be honest with ourselves. There are some overlaps. You know, in my practitioner training, there was not one class dedicated to social issues. Not one. And the more I wanted to understand how spirituality and social issues go together, I found that I had to go outside of Science of Mind. The more I wanted to understand how to apply spirituality to social issues, I had to go to teachers like Matthew Fox or Martin Luther King. I had to go outside and leave Science of Mind, and I didn't like that because I've been given so much through this community and through these teachings. But I had to ask myself a very difficult question. Does Science of Mind practice consumer spirituality? And the answer finally came to me. No. Because I'm convinced our movement is a thing of destiny. We have launched a movement that is destined to be the great new religious symposium of modern times. But we're not off the hook, folks. We must make it undeniably clear that we don't practice consumer spirituality because people are smart and they are catching on to this affair and they want more. So, how do we do it? How do we become the great new religious symposium of modern times? Oh, wouldn't you guys like to know? We do exactly what Ernest Holmes did. We meet the demand. There is a demand for deepening. Do you feel it? What? There is a demand for justice and social change. Do you feel it? There is a demand to develop the social consciousness necessary to advance humanity forward, to create a world that works for everyone. Do you feel it? But it's not going to happen by following the status quo. The role of the spiritual person is not to conform to prevailing social conditions. It is to challenge the status quo. Ernest Holmes called himself a nonconformist. Martin Luther King called himself a nonconformist. And who was the greatest nonconformist of all times? Jesus Christ. In spite of the prevailing tendency to conform, said Martin Luther King, we have a mandate to be nonconformists. This command comes from Jesus Christ, the most dedicated nonconformist, whose ethical nonconformity still challenges the conscience of mankind. So there is a demand for a massive shift in our collective consciousness to move away from the myth of scarcity and separation to the divine truth of sufficiency and oneness. We must begin asking ourselves individually and collectively, how can I contribute? Because I am enough, and I have enough, and I have a lot to offer. Versus, what about me? Because I desperately need more. There is a demand for love because there is an epidemic of fear. Do you feel it? Ernest Holmes called religious science the impulsion of love. Did y'all know that? We are the impulsion of love. Who better to meet these demands than us? You see, I believe that we can experience what Ernest Holmes experienced almost 100 years ago, but we need to be current and relevant. Okay? He said we're the great new religious impulsion of modern times. Modern times. That means we need to be at the forefront of technology and society and culture. Because the impulsion of love don't spend time catching up. The impulsion of love is at the cutting edge. It is the force for change. If we don't meet these demands, someone else will. That is the principle of emergent evolution, and that is how God works. Lastly, there is a demand for collective healing. Do you feel it? This will require radical compassion, but maybe not the compassion that we might be thinking. Recently, I learned that the root word of compassion is compati, which means to suffer with. It doesn't mean to change or make better or send love and light. It means to suffer together. We live in a culture that has pathologized sadness, depression, and anger. We have made it wrong. And so when we see it in other people, or even when we feel it in ourselves, we're so quick to try to fix it and make it go away. But it don't work that way. It doesn't work that way. Underneath the pain and suffering, perhaps even underneath harsh words or acts of violence, there is a cry, a demand to feel our pain. Don't look away. Don't deny it. Don't make excuses. Don't bypass it. Stop and just feel our pain. Because the divine is in the depths of darkness, not just the light. So let us not be afraid of it. Let us hold each other and walk right into it. We do not practice consumer spirituality. We are a thing of destiny.